This morning we begin a series in the book of Job. Job is actually a very popular book in the world. Even many who do not profess Christian faith or spend much time reading Scripture know of the book of Job, even if they might occasionally mispronounce it as Job. Job is a book that has brought about much discussion, much disagreement, and much confusion. And I must admit, Job is a challenge that I have, as a preacher, am taking on for the very first time. Now, before we get started on this series, we need to lay down a very important reality. And that is that Job is a parable. We find out in the very first sentence that this is the case. And it would be particularly clear if we were reading it as the original hearers. First, we have this name, Job, a name that wasn't a popular name in the nation of Israel, and actually had two possible symbolic meanings, both which the original readers would have most likely recognized. The first possible meaning of the name Job is, where is God? And the second possible meaning is the persecuted one. I believe somewhere between these two potential meanings is probably the heart of what the author was trying to get at. Now, the second thing that identifies this as a parable right off the start is the description that Job comes from the land of Uz. Doesn't sound like that's a real place, does it? Well, as far as we know, it never has been. There is no land of Uz. It's a make-believe place. It's symboling to the reader something similar to a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, or once upon a time in Never Never Land. It's meant to clue the reader in to the fact that this is a story with a point, with a lesson to teach us, but a story nonetheless. So let's sit back and enjoy some story time as we listen to the first chapter of the book of Job. There once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he had 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants. So that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold feasts in one another's houses and turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them. And he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This is what Job always did. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" And Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, from walking up and down it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well. All that he has is in your power. Only do not stretch out your hand against him." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. One day, when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, another came and said, "The fire of God fell down from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, another came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 columns, made a raid on the camels and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, another came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job arose. He tore his robe, he shaved his head, and he fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, you thought 2020 was looking pretty bad. Imagine just this one day of Job's life, and if you read on to chapter 2, you find out that tomorrow is not any better. This story leaves us with so many questions, big questions that are hard to answer. Questions like, what in the world is Satan doing hanging out with God? And why is God making a deal with Satan at Job's expense? I think there's a couple of answers to this that we must hold on to in order to not miss the point. First, we must remember that this is a story, that this is not a first-hand account of this conversation. Obviously, the author would not have been there to hear said conversation, and Job knew nothing of said conversation. What we have here, this dialogue between God and the heavenly beings and Satan, is a literary device that's used to help us enter into the story in a deeper way, and to make sure that we know that this isn't a story just about earthly suffering, but that it's also about God's interaction with that suffering. This literary device reminds me of the device that many authors will use of giving you first-person knowledge of the insight in someone's head, in a character's head. Whenever they do that, it helps you to dive more deeply into the actions going on rather than just hearing descriptions of them. So this first chapter, and actually the second, which is very similar, actually has some redundant pieces. This first chapter has a purpose. And that purpose is to introduce us to the point of this whole book. And I'll tell you what, I've always thought that the point of this book was to be a theological argument against the idea that suffering is related to sinfulness. That it was a book that was attempting to answer the big question of why do bad things happen to good people? But now that I look at it again, I realize that's not really what's going on here. And in fact, as we see much later in this book, it doesn't really answer the question. That question. At least not in any satisfying way. The answer to the question of why do bad things happen to good people in this book is because they do. Not a very satisfying answer. So if answering that question is not the purpose, then what? Well, I actually think the purpose is found in that conversation between God and Satan. Prior to that conversation, we learn a bit about Job. We learn that Job is pious and good. It's made abundantly clear in the beginning. He's labeled as being blameless and upright, fearing God and turning from evil. He's called the greatest of all the people. He's so good that he even does extra pious things to make sure that any potential sin of his children would be covered. We also learn that Job is very well off. 7 sons and 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and so many servants, the author doesn't even bother to count them. And so what we see is that the question being posed by Satan isn't about suffering happening to good people. It's actually a question about how closely is Job's piety or faithfulness tied to his prosperity and abundance. Is Job only faithful because God has blessed him so? Satan is convinced that Job is in fact only pious because of God's abundant blessings. It also seems in this conversation like maybe God is kind of curious to find out if that is true. And so he allows Satan to take away Job's blessing. And so what is the nature of this question? What's at the heart of this question is the nature of the covenant between God and people. It asks the question, are we only faithful to God because God has blessed us? I came across an idea that was developed by a French abbot in the 12th century named Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard came up with this theory on the way that humans love God. And he sees it as a 4-stage process. Stage 1 is a human loving oneself for the sake of oneself. He says that that's an important part in the process of learning to really love God, is to first learn to love ourselves for our own sake. And the reason that's important is because it leads to step 2, and step 2 is learning to love God for the sake of ourselves. We love God because we know it will be good for us in the end. The next step, the next stage in this process would be stage 3, which is the love of God for God's sake. Loving God just because God is God. And then stage 4, which we won't really get into today, is the idea that we then learn to love ourselves for God's sake. Job, many centuries before Bernard came up with this idea, seems to be testing this theory. The proposal of Satan is that Job, and therefore all of us, are only really ever able to attain stage 2, loving God for the sake of ourselves. That we love God only because we know it's good for us. And let me say that I'm not just talking about the prosperity gospel here, although I believe that's covered in this section as kind of the lowest version of it. But it's also, in this idea, it would be following God for the sake of gratitude. Because that really is just following God because of what God has already done for us. And the thing we typically express our gratitude the most for is God's saving action in Jesus Christ. Satan is convinced that that's as far as Job or any of us can go. But Job proves Satan wrong. Job proves that even when all is lost, when the blessings have been wiped away, and when there are no new blessings visible on the horizon, that he will remain faithful to God. Now, Job does what's appropriate, and he mourns his losses. He tears his robe, he shaves his head. I'm not sure why that's such a bad thing. And he falls to the ground. And then what does he do? It tells us that he worships God. He says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And then the author makes sure we know that Job has not sinned or charged God with any wrongdoing. Job, in this very first chapter, is proving that stage 3, the love of God for God's sake, is possible. So what does that mean for us? I think it means that it might be time for us to do sort of a spiritual check on ourselves, a system analysis, a search to discover our true motivations. Do we love and worship God only because of what God has done for us? Or do we love and worship God because God is God and is worthy of our love and worship? Because if our love and worship is tied to our blessings, then it will always be temporary, as we know that hard times are a-coming. But if we can learn to love and worship God based on a deep belief that God is worthy of said love and worship, then that will remain with us in the ups and downs and through it all. Job seems to be calling each one of us to level up in our love and worship of God, to understand God's goodness separated from our own life experience, to trust that God is with us even when it doesn't feel like it. And to God be all the glory, now and forevermore. Amen.